Few people today know just how brutal life aboard a medieval galleon could be. Did you know that at least half of the crew could die on a single voyage? Disease, malnutrition, and violent storms didn't just threaten their lives, they defined them. So how did anyone live through it? And what lessons can you take from their resilience? Stick with me to explore a day in the life of these unsung survivors. What if your bedroom, living room, and dining area were all rolled into one tiny, filthy wooden box? And that box just so happened to be floating on an unpredictable ocean. That's your life now. Welcome to the living quarters of a medieval galleon. You'd find yourself crammed below deck, squeezed into a space so tight it'd make a modern subway car feel luxurious. Crew members were packed in shoulder to shoulder with just enough room to lie down. Sometimes not even that if the ship was overstaffed, which it frequently was. Privacy? Forget it. The moment you packed up your life to sail on one of these ships, privacy stopped existing. Below deck, everyone slept together in the same large, suffocating area, and the only semblance of personal space might have been however far you could stretch your arm before hitting the next guy's leg. Oh, and don't expect a cozy bed with blankets. Instead, you'd be lucky to claim a straw mat or a hammock, both of which would often be damp thanks to the ever-present humidity at sea. And if the damp didn't bother you, perhaps the rats would. Rats didn't just scuttle through the shadows below deck, they were basically unofficial crew members living off the crumbs of your rations or, occasionally, your rations themselves. And where there are rats, there are fleas. Most sailors endured constant itching, and unchecked infestations of fleas or lice were simply accepted as part of ship life. Combine that with the overwhelming stench of hundreds of unwashed bodies crammed together, and you can start to imagine why no one looked forward to turning in for the night. Still, sleep was necessary, no matter how unpleasant. The brutal shipboard schedule meant sailors had to grab what little rest they could. But falling asleep in those conditions wasn't exactly easy. The stifling heat made the air thick and heavy down there, especially when the ship entered warmer climates. Ever tried cramming into a packed elevator with no air conditioning? Now imagine this elevator sways constantly, smells like sweat, mold, and rotting food, and has a few dozen rats dashing around for good measure. Congratulations, you've just imagined the galleon's crew quarters on their best day. Add in poor ventilation that trapped all those lovely odors, and it's no surprise the smell could occasionally cause nausea. Venturing below deck after spending time in crisp sea air would have hit the senses like walking into a room full of spoiled milk and wet dogs. The odors permeated everything because, well, there was no escape. If you think the lack of comfort was bad, the noise was its own unique form of torture. Above your head, you'd hear constant creaks and groans as the wooden planks shifted with the waves. This wasn't just an occasional sound, it was a constant, oppressive racket that got worse in rough seas. Let's not forget the shouting. Whether it was officers barking orders, sailors yelling warnings, or someone just losing their temper, there was almost always some level of chaotic noise echoing throughout the ship. Even the sounds of water sloshing against the hull might not have been soothing, depending on how violently the ocean was moving. What might seem like white noise to some could quickly become an endless source of stress, especially when paired with the constant rocking, jolting, and sway that made relaxation nearly impossible. Forget soothing sleep. With the ship tilting back and forth, some poor souls never really got their sea legs or their stomachs settled. The hierarchy among the crew added another layer of discomfort. Officers typically enjoyed private quarters or at least larger, more comfortable spaces, separated from the rest of the men below deck. This physical separation reinforced an invisible, ever-present barrier between the officers and the labouring crew. Below deck, sailors were left to jockey for the least unpleasant spots to sleep, and the power dynamics among them could lead to occasional skirmishes. The unspoken rules dictated that higher-ranking crew members, even among those who didn't have their own quarters, would still secure better places, the corners or spots farther away from the foot traffic. Low-ranking sailors or new recruits might find themselves stuck in the worst sections, closer to the bilge, a dank, humid area filled with stagnant water and an ever-present stench of rot. This environment wasn't just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. Between the tight quarters, poor ventilation, and lack of fresh food, the galleon quickly became a breeding ground for illness. Diseases like dysentery spread easily in conditions where hygiene wasn't just neglected, it was virtually impossible to maintain. Fresh water was rationed, which meant washing regularly wasn't an option. and when diseases, like scurvy, reared their ugly head, caused by a diet severely lacking in vitamin C, things could get really grim. Scurvy wasn't just about bleeding gums or feeling weak. Over time, it deteriorated the body from the inside, leaving sailors bedridden and riddled with sores as they drifted closer to death. Dysentery, on the other hand, killed more quickly but just as unpleasantly, with severe diarrhea leaving its victims dehydrated and fragile. When these illnesses swept through the crew, and they often did, it could thin the numbers within weeks, and quarters that once felt overcrowded could suddenly feel eerily empty. Sometimes sailors would try to distract themselves from the misery through whatever means they could find. They told crude jokes, sang songs, or simply talked about their lives back home. The rare moments of laughter and shared camaraderie might have seemed trivial, but they were often what kept sailors hanging on, psychologically at least. Morale was already low when the ship was stocked and ready to set sail. Imagine how much worse it got after weeks, even months of living in these conditions. More seasoned sailors learned to switch off, simply enduring their surroundings with a sort of numb acceptance. But for new recruits, or anyone already weak before the journey began, the effort to stay positive could be a losing battle. The combination of discomfort, illness, and emotional strain meant life below deck wasn't just unpleasant. It was survival at the most basic and brutal levels. Ships needed manpower to reach their destinations, and every sailor was expendable. There was no time for pity and no room for grace. You adapted or you didn't. That's why the hardships of living below deck were just the first test. The constant, exhausting grind of the job itself awaited. Sailors didn't sign up for relief or comfort. Every day promised a new set of challenges, ones that could break even the strongest crew member. Now imagine waking up in this nightmare and heading straight into back-breaking labour, knowing that even a moment's distraction could cost your life. Let's talk about the daily grind aboard a medieval galleon. Imagine you've just dragged yourself out of a restless slumber in a damp, rat-infested quarter. There's no sunrise to greet you below deck, just the sound of someone yelling that it's time for your watch. Your day on a medieval galleon begins before the sun is even close to rising and doesn't end until long after it sets. Out here, work isn't just a task, it's an unyielding routine driven by survival and the constant demands of the ship. 4 hours on, 4 hours off, around the clock. But don't get too comfortable with the off hours. If a storm rolls through, or even the slightest change in wind direction, your rest will evaporate faster than a bucket of water tossed overboard. Emergencies don't punch a clock. Your first job might be simple, like hauling supplies. Simple, but definitely not easy. Imagine shoving barrels of salted meat or casks of water across the uneven shifting deck while trying not to get knocked off balance yourself. These weren't light containers, by the way. Every step was a reminder that gravity would much rather toss you into the sea than keep you upright. Below deck, other sailors might be tasked with caulking, pressing fibres called oakum into the spaces between wooden planks. You'd hear the relentless tap of mallets as they sealed each seam of the ship to keep water from leaking in. And leaks were plentiful. Galleons were sturdy, sure, but the ocean always found new ways to sneak inside, turning sailors into non-stop damage control crews. Then there was deck scrubbing. It sounds mundane until you try it after a week of exposure to salt water, spilled tar, stray fish guts, and footprints from 100 unwashed boots. Hygiene was rare enough aboard a galleon that this tedious chore wasn't about vanity. It was critical to keeping filth and the diseases that came with it under control. You'd get on your hands and knees with coarse brushes, scraping at wooden boards while the coarse bristles bit back at your skin. This wasn't an occasional task either. It happened daily, sometimes more, if any accident left the deck looking, let's just say, worse than usual. Maintenance wasn't the end of it, though. Sails, those massive cloth wings that propelled the ship forward, needed constant attention. Adjusting them wasn't as simple as yanking on a rope. It often involved climbing the rigging, a web of ropes and masts that could stretch dozens of feet into the air. Picture climbing while the ship sways beneath you, waves crashing against the hull and wind whipping your face. On calm days, this was simply nerve-wracking. In a storm, it became an outright death trap. A fall from the rigging didn't just mean broken bones, it often spelled a one-way trip into the freezing, chaotic waters below. Even handling the sails on deck required strength. The sheets were thick and heavy, soaked by sea spray, and wrangling them wasn't a one-man job. You'd team up to raise or lower a sail, the weight of the fabric pulling your arms to their limits. And guess what? Everything needed adjusting regularly. The wind didn't run on a schedule, so neither did the crew. The sea loves its surprises. Storms could appear out of nowhere, transforming the ship from a somewhat stable platform into a maddening roller coaster. Rain lashed at your face. Wind roared so loud you couldn't hear people shouting at you from mere feet away. And yet, you still had to climb, pull, tie, hammer, and haul. Imagine gripping a rope for dear life, your knuckles white, while waves crashed over the side of the ship. Slippery, uneven footing meant every step could be your last. Below deck, another crew would be furiously working to bail out any water flooding in. Stormwater didn't just spill in little puddles, it could pool near your feet, sloshing back and forth as the ship rocked violently. Too much water below deck, and the entire vessel was at risk of sinking. Even in calm weather, the work didn't let up. There was always something to repair, clean, or manage. If you were lucky enough to have a steady wind and untroubled seas, the officers might assign tasks like mending ropes or stitching up sails. These weren't physically taxing jobs, but after weeks of physical labor, your body might ache too much to tell the difference. Joints stiffened from repetitive work. Backs hunched from hauling supplies day after day, calloused hands that felt raw no matter how many layers of skin they lost. Your body felt every second of life aboard. The danger went beyond storms. Loose equipment became hazards on a ship constantly jostled by waves. An unfastened barrel could turn into a rogue missile when the ship leaned to one side. Worse, heavy sails or blocks on the rigging could fall unexpectedly. A single mistake, whether your own or someone else's, meant serious. Injuries. There weren't advanced first aid kits stored on galleons. Treatment often amounted to crude bandaging and the hope that infections wouldn't spread. The smallest wound could easily turn dangerous in such unsanitary conditions. And let's talk about exhaustion. 4 hours of rest wasn't much, especially when rest didn't always mean sleep. Sometimes it just meant a break from active work, but didn't guarantee the quiet or comfort you'd need to recover completely. The sea didn't care if you were tired. Food was scarce and often unappetizing, leaving sailors underfed for the amount of energy their jobs required. The work pushed everyone to their limits, physically and mentally, but sailors couldn't even rely on good pay to ease the grind. Wages were low, often delayed, and came nowhere near compensating for the physical toll. Despite the relentless demands, discipline on board remained harsh. Officers maintained order through fear, snapping men back to their stations if fatigue made them falter. There were no off days, no leniency for slacking. It was all work all the time. This combination of high expectations, constant danger, and punishing consequences pushed sailors to their breaking point. Even the strongest among them could feel like their endurance wasn't enough. There was no room for hesitation. Hesitate too long on the rigging and you might lose your footing. Zone out while hauling ropes and the ship might drift off course. Every task felt vital because most of them were, especially when the ship depended entirely on human effort to keep moving forward. Machines weren't pulling the sails or bailing water, it was you and the other men around you. The physical weight of the ship was constant, but so was the mental toll. And yet, through exhaustion and injury, the crew found ways to keep going. For now, we'll leave their back-breaking labour behind and take a look at how they dealt with one of life's other inescapable necessities: food, or the lack of it. What if every meal wasn't just bland and repetitive, but also came with the possibility of turning your stomach, or worse, sending you to an early grave? That was the reality for sailors aboard a medieval galleon. The daily menu featured a grim lineup: hardtack, salted meat, dried peas, and maybe, if the stars aligned, a small taste of fish pulled fresh from the sea. But before you imagine a rustic seafood meal, let's break this down. Hardtack was the most reliable food, though calling it food might give it too much credit. This wasn't some warm, fluffy loaf of bread. Hardtack was basically a dense, rock-like biscuit made to withstand the test of time, which it did in good and bad ways. Stored in barrels alongside the other supplies, hardtack didn't go stale because it was never really fresh to begin with. The problem? It often became a playground for maggots and weevils. These tiny critters would worm their way inside, so sailors had to tap their biscuits on the table to knock out the bugs before eating. And no, they didn't throw it away. Bugs or not, that biscuit still got eaten. After all, hunger has a way of lowering your standards. The salted meat wasn't much better. It earned its name because it was packed in enough salt to make your mouth pucker just thinking about it. This wasn't done for flavor, it was for preservation. Without refrigeration, the salt slowed down spoilage, though it didn't stop it entirely. By the time you reached the meat at the bottom of the barrel, it often had a slimy texture and an odor that left little doubt about its declining state. Unless you liked brine-soaked beef with a side of nausea, it wasn't exactly something to get excited about. Despite its questionable quality, it provided enough protein to keep the crew going, which was crucial when every day demanded back-breaking physical labor. Then there were the dried peas. This was the main attempt at getting vegetables into the sailors' diets, though calling them vegetables feels generous. Before cooking, they were shriveled and tough, like tiny green rocks. When the ship's cook submerged them in boiling water, they softened into something resembling mush. Throw in a little salt, if there was any to spare, and this peas and water combo became a sad excuse for soup. But at least they were unlikely to spoil, which is more than you could say for much of the other food on board. If you were lucky or persistent, you might manage to catch some fish. But fishing at sea was hit or miss. The ship wasn't about to stop sailing just because you wanted to throw in a line, so any fishing had to be done on the move. Catching and filleting a fish sounded like a culinary jackpot compared to everything else. But even fresh catches weren't always the solution they seemed to be. If you didn't cook it immediately, the fish would begin to rot, especially in warmer climates. And considering the ship's crude cooking conditions, even the freshest fish might become overcooked and bland by the time it hit your plate. While the question of what to eat dominated the day, the question of what to drink was just as grim. Clean drinking water was a rarity aboard a galleon. Water stored in barrels didn't stay fresh for long, especially in the heat and humidity below deck. A couple of months into the voyage, your drinking water would start to develop a noticeable green tint, courtesy of algae that thrived in the stagnant wooden casks. If you found yourself hesitating over a cup of swamp-coloured water, beer was often the next best option. The fermentation process made it safer to drink than the brackish water, and it provided some calories too, but drinking beer all the time had its own downsides. It didn't exactly hydrate you the same way clean water would, and let's be honest, it didn't pair well with maggot-infested hardtack. Speaking of unwelcome additions to your food, spoilage was constant. The humid, hot environment of the ship wasn't exactly conducive to food preservation. Barrels of meat or grains could quickly become breeding grounds for mold, rats, and insects. It wasn't just annoying, it was a genuine health hazard. Mouldy hardtack and tainted meat didn't just taste bad, they could make you sick. With sailors already dealing with rigorous labor and limited rest, falling ill from bad food could be the beginning of the end. Rations, therefore, became tightly controlled. Each crew member received a fixed portion of food each day, a handful of hardtack, a chunk of salted meat, and enough beer to wash it all down. This system wasn't just about fairness, it was survival. The longer the voyage lasted, the more supplies dwindled. Eating more than the assigned ration didn't just mean you'd make someone else go without, it could push the entire crew into starvation territory before reaching the destination. The ship's cook had the unenviable task of turning this collection of bland and often borderline inedible ingredients into something resembling a meal, all while working in less than ideal conditions. The galley, or ship's kitchen, was a small space with limited tools for heating food. On stormy days, the rolling of the sea made cooking even more hazardous. Imagine trying to boil peas on a swaying stove while dodging spills and open flames. The lack of variety and nutrition in this diet led to predictable disaster. Scurvy, caused by a deficiency of vitamin C, was rampant on long voyages. Its symptoms started subtly: fatigue and feeling generally unwell. But before long, sailors' gums would start bleeding, their teeth falling out. Severe cases left victims bedridden, their bodies covered in open sores until death finally came as a grim release. Historians estimate that scurvy alone killed more sailors than battles ever did. A single orange, a lemon, or even a handful of fresh vegetables could have prevented all of it, but those luxuries weren't aboard the ship. Yet despite all this, sailors found moments of resilience. They'd find ways to make meals a little less miserable, often through sheer creativity. When spices like pepper or nutmeg, rarities on a ship, made their way into certain dishes, meals suddenly felt more bearable, even enjoyable. Rumours about better cooks circulated among the crew, with sailors singing the praises of those who could stretch the rations into halfway decent meals. And when all else failed, jokes, shared complaints, and camaraderie during mealtimes served as a brief escape from the grim reality of life at sea. Even with these small victories, meals on board were a daily reminder of the thin line between survival and suffering. But food wasn't the only obstacle. Starvation and disease brought enough tension on their own, and the tight quarters paired with grueling discipline only made matters worse. Let's talk about how sailors navigated the harsh, highly ordered world of rules, punishment, and the ever-looming threat of chaos. Picture this. Your days may be weeks into a voyage. Your body aches from constant labor. You're running on minimal sleep, and that crusty biscuit you managed to choke down this morning didn't do much to fill you up. Tensions are high, and with no sign of land on the horizon, every day feels like a lifetime. Now imagine a voice shouting orders above deck, sharp and uncompromising. No room for questions, no room for hesitation. You're expected to obey instantly. That's how discipline worked on a medieval galleon. Absolute and unforgiving. The hierarchy on board was as rigid as the ship's masts. At the top, you had the captain, the ultimate authority. His word wasn't up for discussion, it was law. Below him, officers like the master and the first mate acted as enforcers, carrying out his orders and ensuring the crew stayed in line. The captain didn't micromanage every task, but he influenced every decision that shaped life on the ship. From daily routines to disciplinary actions, his power touched every corner of the galleon. The officers, meanwhile, kept the engine running, except in this case, the engine was the 100 or so sweat-soaked sailors doing the grunt work. But maintaining order wasn't just about shouting commands, it was about consequences. Flogging was one of the most common punishments. If you were lazy, disobedient, or just happened to irritate the wrong officer, you'd find yourself tied to a grating or mast and whipped with a cat-o'-nine-tails. A whip designed to cause maximum pain. Each strike tore into your skin, leaving deep welts or breaking the skin entirely. And while the physical scars would heal eventually, the humiliation of being punished in front of the entire crew could stick with you much longer. Everyone watched. Everyone knew what you'd done or were accused of doing. Out here, reputation mattered, even for those at the bottom of the ladder. Now, if flogging sounds bad, keel hauling makes it look like a slap on the wrist. Keel hauling was reserved for more severe offences: mutiny, theft, or anything else deemed truly unforgivable. Picture this. The accused is tied with heavy ropes and thrown over one side of the ship, dragged underneath it, then pulled up on the other side. If the barnacle-covered hull didn't scrape you within an inch of your life, the lack of air or the freezing water probably would. Few who endured it survived intact, and those who did weren't much use to the crew afterward. The scars, both literal and metaphorical, left a clear message: step out of line and the consequences could be fatal. Still, for all the intimidation, these punishments didn't always prevent conflict. Sailors were human, after all, sleep-deprived, starving, and trapped on a floating wooden prison for months. Resentment brewed just under the surface. A bad officer, quick with punishments or slow with rations, could turn the whole crew against him. In extreme cases, this led to mutinies. For example, if the captain failed to keep the crew fed or sheltered during harsh conditions, or worse, hoarded supplies for himself, you might hear whispers of rebellion below deck. Mutinies were rare, but not unheard of, and when they happened, they put everyone's life on a razor's edge. Success meant fresh leadership. Failure meant a swift, brutal death for anyone involved. But it wasn't always about outright defiance. Sometimes it was the small, quiet acts of rebellion that said the most. Disobeying orders in subtle ways, dragging your feet during tasks, secretly sharing extra rations with crew members who'd been punished. These were risks sailors sometimes took to maintain a shred of dignity. Of course, such defiance wasn't easily tolerated. The officers were constantly on alert, watching for anyone who might undermine their authority. And they weren't afraid to remind the crew of their power. A trial, if you could call it that, was little more than a formality. Punishments could feel random, handed out with a sense of personal vengeance rather than fairness. To make things worse, this heavy-handed approach often created a vicious cycle. Fear was meant to keep the crew in line, but it also bred distrust. If you couldn't rely on your officers to act rationally, or even care about your well-being, how could you be expected to give them your full obedience? Morale plummeted when punishments became too harsh or too frequent. On some trips, sailors were less concerned about what the ocean might do to them and more worried about what their captain would. The truth was, moments of stability on a galleon were fragile and fleeting. Even with strict discipline, chaos was always lurking just around the corner. Picture it. A sudden storm rolls in. Waves pitch the ship violently, the deck becomes a slippery death trap, and the crew scrambles to save the sails. People are shouting, orders are flying, and it's pure survival mode. In these moments, the rigid hierarchy could break down. Crew members would prioritize saving their own lives over following protocol, and officers sometimes couldn't reassert control until the immediate danger passed. Similarly, an enemy attack could push the entire order to its limits. When cannons started firing and the deck filled with smoke, fear and panic overpowered discipline in many cases. The officers relied on obedience to maintain order, but the unpredictability of the sea often proved stronger than their commands. Still, discipline wasn't just about punishment and fear, it was about function. A ship this size didn't run on goodwill alone. Every sail needed rigging, every cannon needed a crew, and every task had to be executed with precision. Without strict organization, there'd be chaos before they even left port. But make no mistake, the galleon's success often came at the expense of its crew. The psychological toll of living under constant surveillance and threat of punishment was as heavy as the physical labor. Sailors weren't just working, they were surviving, sometimes just a bad decision away from disaster. But strangely enough, in these harsh conditions, you'd still find moments of resilience. Even with the punishments and the grueling labor, sailors found ways to cope. Through shared jokes, music, or superstitious rituals, they built small connections that reminded them of their humanity, however brief those moments might have been. And that's where we're heading next, the spaces in between the chaos, where camaraderie and creativity gave these men just enough strength to make it through the journey. Even in the harshest conditions, humans always seem to find little moments to connect, create, or just forget about the mess around them, even if only for a while. A medieval galleon was no different. Imagine the scene, sailors sitting on crates or leaning against the rails during one of their rare lulls in the day. Someone might start humming a tune, and before long others would join in, their rough voices blending into a crude but earnest form of music. Out there, with no land in sight and no distractions beyond the horizon, even something as simple as a shared song could feel like a lifeline. Music wasn't just entertainment. It was a small rebellion against the monotony and misery of the daily grind. Since proper instruments weren't typically part of the ship's inventory, sailors got creative. Maybe someone found a scrap of wood that could be fashioned into a percussion tool, or used a piece of rope to create something string-like. If nothing else, clapping or stomping could keep the rhythm alive. These songs and makeshift tunes weren't about artistry, they were about surviving the emotional weight of life at sea. A cheerful shanty might lift morale, while a melancholy ballad could give the men space to remember the families and lives they'd left behind. Music created a sense of community, a reminder that they weren't enduring this alone. If music wasn't your thing, storytelling filled the gaps. Someone might launch into an old folk tale or a bawdy tale about a crewmate's ridiculous misadventures. These stories could transport listeners away from the endless waves to some magical forest, distant land, or even just back to memories of home. The kind of stories that made the rounds weren't always light-hearted. Some were harrowing accounts of past voyages gone wrong, warnings passed down in the form of gripping, personal narratives. But whether the story was meant to inspire a laugh or raise a chill, it helped stave off the mental stagnation that came from staring at the same wooden boards and open water every single day. Games, though humble, offered another welcome distraction. Dice were a common choice, with carved bone or wooden sets passed down by previous sailors or improvised during the journey. A simple game of chance might serve as a brief escape, with bets placed on meagre prizes like extra food or a rare patch of quiet downtime. Sometimes, physical challenges like improvised wrestling matches sprang up. Competition gave sailors a way to let off steam and focus on something outside the endless labor. Sure, at times these games ended in disputes or outright brawls. Not every match stayed friendly, especially when food or pride was on the line. But even that tension could be better than the oppressive silence of an otherwise joyless day. Superstitions added their own unique flavor to life on a galleon. Sailors were deeply aware of their vulnerability at sea, and their rituals and beliefs provided a comforting illusion of control over the chaos. Maybe someone would toss a coin overboard as an offering to the sea gods, hoping for calm waters. Others adhered to strict taboos. For example, whistling on deck was said to invite windy storms. These traditions weren't just about fear, they gave sailors a shared set of habits and practices that brought unity. Even if they didn't fully believe the rituals worked, performing them together was its own kind of comfort. It was a reminder, however small, that they were part of something larger, connected not only to their fellow crew members but to the long line of sailors who had faced similar struggles across history. When moments of calm surfaced, maybe during good weather or after a long day's work, it wasn't unusual for camaraderie to take centre stage. These weren't grand celebrations with the crew sitting in circles swapping deep conversations about life or human purpose. It was more muted, a shared joke here, a quiet laugh there. Someone might mimic an officer's pompous attitude or reenact an embarrassing stumble from earlier in the day. Laughter, even in small doses, broke up the endless weight of monotony and gave sailors a brief chance to feel human again. And when moments like this stretched into the evening with the stars finally visible overhead, men might band together to sit quietly, appreciating the rare peace while it lasted. Of course, these moments were often fleeting. Just as suddenly as they started, they could be interrupted. The sharp call of an officer's order, the unexpected rise of dark clouds on the horizon, or even the sudden crack of wood signaling trouble below deck. The demands of the ship always came first, and anything that wasn't essential quickly took a back seat to survival. These constant interruptions weren't just annoying, they reminded everyone that joy was temporary, that danger was never more than a heartbeat away. It's no wonder superstition persisted so strongly. When the sea could upend everything with a single unexpected wave, rituals provided strength where control was non-existent. For all the gloom, the need to share these fleeting moments of joy wasn't just about passing the time. It was about survival. It's easy to forget the psychological toll of isolation and hardship, but for sailors, these small glimpses of humanity weren't optional. They held the crew together, fostering a bond strong enough to withstand the worst the sea could throw at them. While officers sometimes participated in these lighter moments, they rarely shared in the same vulnerability. Among the rank-and-file crew, these connections went deeper, proving that even in the most punishing circumstances, people can still choose to connect rather than withdraw. It's this ability to connect that really defined the human spirit aboard a galleon. They didn't have community-building workshops or team-building exercises. They had jokes, songs, rituals, and games. Together, these moments kept them tethered to one another, gave them a sense of purpose, and reminded them of why surviving the voyage mattered, not just for trade or duty, but for the people alongside them in the struggle. Still, no song, story, or game could truly shield them from the dangers surrounding them. If camaraderie provided a bit of armor for the soul, the crew still had to contend with nature's unrelenting onslaught. Whether laughing or singing the night before, they always woke up to the reality that the sea's greatest challenge was still waiting. Storms, waves, and shipwrecks. These were the biggest tests of survival, and they were ones no amount of music or folklore could ever prepare them for. Let's explore just how merciless the ocean truly was and why, against all odds, it turned sailors' brief moments of joy into symbols of their daring resilience. What if your life hung entirely on the ocean's mercy? For medieval sailors, crossing open water wasn't a scenic cruise. It was a gamble where luck, skill, and endurance were your only lifelines. The sea could be calm one minute, a mirror of blue stretching endlessly into the horizon. But then, without warning, it could turn into a nightmare. Storms didn't politely announce their arrival, they just hit. Sudden squalls sent winds howling through the rigging, whipping the sails violently as waves rose to towering heights. Picture standing on deck, clinging desperately to whatever you could grab. As the ship tilted so far, it felt like it might capsize. Rain pelted down in sheets, drenching every inch of you, and the roaring winds made shouting pointless. There was no conversation, no plan, just pure survival as the ship groaned and creaked its protests against the ocean's fury. For these sailors, weather patterns were unpredictable at best and completely baffling at worst. Without modern forecasts or equipment, the only warning they got about an incoming storm came from their own eyes, often too little, too late. A sudden shift in the wind or the ominous sight of dark clouds on the horizon might be all they had before chaos erupted. Rogue waves, towering walls of water that seemed to rise out of nowhere, added another layer of unpredictability. Unlike regular waves, these were freak occurrences, capable of slamming into a ship with enough force to roll it like a toy. If you were lucky, the ship survived. If not, the sea claimed everything: cargo, vessel, and lives. Navigating these treacherous waters was an art that bordered on guesswork. Medieval sailors relied on the stars, basic charts, and their instincts to figure out where they were and where they needed to go. On clear nights when the stars were visible, navigation could feel almost magical, a rare moment of order in an otherwise unpredictable world. But this magic came crashing down the moment clouds rolled in. With no GPS, no reliable maps, and no visibility, they were left practically blind. A single miscalculation could send the ship miles off course, straight into dangerous shallows or rocky shores. And once you hit trouble, there wasn't an undo button. Shipwrecks were an all-too-common reality for galleons, with entire voyages ending in disaster because someone misread the stars or overestimated the vessel's sturdiness. Shipwreck accounts from the period are grim reading. Take the story of ships caught in storms that broke their masts, leaving them adrift and at the ocean's mercy. Imagine a crew working furiously to save their ship, plugging leaks, cutting loose splintered wood, and bailing water over the side, all while knowing they might be battling a losing fight. Even when they managed to hold off disaster for a while, there was no guarantee what came next. If the cargo shifted suddenly or the structure weakened further, the entire ship could break apart, spilling men and supplies into the icy, thrashing waves. Survival wasn't just improbable, it was a rarity. For those unlucky enough to face a sinking vessel, desperation filled the air. Crews might cling to floating debris or makeshift rafts, but the odds rarely favoured them. The freezing Atlantic currents sapped strength within minutes, and drowning wasn't the only threat. In some cases, sharks could sense a wreck from miles away, drawn by the chaos and flesh in the water. Surviving a shipwreck often meant facing days of sun exposure without food or water, adrift in the middle of nowhere. Rescue came down to pure chance. If another ship spotted the wreckage in time, a few lives might be spared. Most of the time, though, the sea simply took what it wanted. Despite its dangers, the ocean wasn't just a destroyer. It was also a provider, a paradox medieval sailors understood deeply. Without the sea, there was no trade, no livelihood, no fish to feed their families. They revered it as much as they feared it. This duality shaped the way sailors approached life aboard their galleon. They performed rituals, prayed to deities tied to the sea, and stuck religiously to superstitions designed to appease the water's wrath. No whistling on the deck, it might summon the winds. A coin tossed into the sea wasn't just a waste, it was an offering. For them, the ocean wasn't just water, it was an entity, and one that could change its mood at any time. Those who survived these trials emerged transformed. There's something about facing that much unpredictability, heartbreak, and fear that hardened sailors in ways nothing else could. Surviving a storm wasn't just about tending the sails or steering the ship, it was about surviving together. The bonds formed during these moments ran deep. Imagine pulling a crewmate out of the waves or hauling someone to safety on the deck while the storm raged on. It wasn't every man for himself, it couldn't be. Loyalty wasn't optional. It was what got everyone through the worst of what the sea could conjure. And yet, even after surviving the worst conditions, those bonds didn't dissolve the instant danger passed. They carried over into the calmer days, the mundane tasks, and even the precious few moments of shared laughter. Sailors hardened by their experiences knew that their survival depended on one another. A man who faltered might drag others down with him, but supporting the weakest among them often meant increasing the crew's overall strength. In this way, the sea shaped its sailors as much emotionally as it did physically. But the sea was an unforgiving master. Surviving one storm didn't guarantee anything about the voyage as a whole. That knowledge hung in the back of every sailor's mind every time they noticed the sky darken or felt the wind shift. It wasn't something they talked about openly. Instead, they endured day after day, fully aware that the ocean could decide at any moment that it had taken enough mercy on them. This life, the constant hardships, the crushing uncertainty, and the brutal endurance tests defined a medieval sailor as much as any work or battle they faced. Every survivor carried the weight of their experiences long after their feet landed back on solid ground, and that resilience stands as proof of their grit. And though we live in a world of charts, forecasts, and safety equipment today, their stories still remind us what it means to survive the uncontrollable and the unpredictable. They're a testament to the human spirit clinging to hope in the face of overwhelming odds. A flicker of light pressed against an all-consuming darkness. And maybe their example leaves us with something worth considering. When the world throws wild storms our way, would we have the strength to hold the lines together? Life aboard a medieval galleon wasn't just a job, it was survival stripped to its core. Every moment was a test of endurance against hunger, disease, exhaustion, and the unrelenting sea. Yet through it all, sailors pushed forward, creating connections, innovating navigation, and expanding the world's horizons. Their hardships paved the way for global trade and cultural exchange, shaping the interconnected world we live in today. So, what can we learn from their experience? Resilience, adaptability, and the power of community under unimaginable pressure. Now, imagine yourself in their place. How would you fare? Let me know in the comments and stay curious.